There is a liquid sitting in your kitchen right now that can wipe out some of the most stubborn weeds in America for less than the price of a cup of coffee. Crabgrass, dandelions, thistle, clover, even invasive weeds that homeowners spend hundreds of dollars fighting every single year. The bottle costs about $2. You can find it in almost any grocery store. And yet, most people walk past it without realizing what it can do. Instead, they buy expensive weed killers. They spray chemical herbicides across their lawns. They return to the store again and again every season, spending $40, $60, sometimes hundreds of dollars trying to solve the exact same problem. But what if one of the cheapest weed killers ever discovered has been hiding in plain sight the entire time? What if generations of farmers knew about it long before modern herbicide companies existed? And what if the science proving it works has been sitting in public archives for decades while almost nobody talks about it? Because the story you're about to hear is not just about weeds. It's about a $2 solution that somehow disappeared from public memory. And once you learn its name, you'll never look at the bottle under your kitchen sink the same way again. The story takes an interesting turn in 1971, because this is where a simple kitchen liquid unexpectedly found its way into a university field trial. A researcher was testing different methods for controlling invasive weeds on a mixed plot of land. Nothing unusual. At least, that was the expectation. The trial was supposed to last several weeks. Researchers expected gradual results, careful observations, pages of data collected over time. Instead, something happened that nobody anticipated. Within just a few days, large sections of the test plot were already changing. Broadleaf weeds began to wilt, leaves curled inward, stems started collapsing. By the end of the first week, entire sections of unwanted vegetation were gone. Not weakened. Not struggling. Gone. The researcher carefully documented the results and submitted the findings through the normal academic channels. And then she waited. Because this was the kind of result that should have attracted attention, funding, follow-up studies, industry interest. At least that was the expectation. But none of it happened. No major herbicide manufacturer rushed to investigate. No flood of commercial interest arrived. No race to develop products around the discovery. Instead, the findings quietly disappeared into university archives. Which raises a fascinating question. What was this mysterious liquid that produced results strong enough to surprise researchers, yet somehow failed to capture the attention of an industry worth billions of dollars? The answer is sitting in millions of kitchens right now. The liquid was vinegar. Plain white distilled vinegar. The same bottle sitting on grocery store shelves. The same bottle people use for cooking, cleaning, and pickling vegetables. Nothing exotic, nothing patented, nothing locked behind a laboratory door. Just vinegar, 5% acetic acid, water, and almost nothing else. That is what makes this story so strange. Because when most people think about weed killers, they imagine complicated chemical names, bright warning labels, specialized formulas, products that promise professional results for $40 a bottle. Nobody looks at a $2 bottle of vinegar and thinks about weed control. And yet, for thousands of years, people did exactly that. Long before modern herbicide companies existed. Long before garden centers filled entire aisles with weed-killing products. Long before television commercials convinced homeowners that every problem required a specialized chemical solution. Farmers were already using vinegar. Not because a company told them to. Not because a marketing campaign persuaded them. Because it worked. Generation after generation. Across different continents. Across different civilizations. The knowledge survived because the results were impossible to ignore. Which raises another question. If farmers knew this, if researchers confirmed it, and if the bottle is still sitting on store shelves today, then why does vinegar kill weeds so effectively in the first place? Because the answer reveals one of the simplest and most elegant pieces of plant science you will ever see. What makes vinegar so fascinating is not that it works. It is how long people have known that it works. Long before herbicide companies existed. Long before garden centers. Long before warning labels and television commercials. Farmers were already using it. Travel back nearly 5,000 years to the fertile lands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The ancient Sumerians were building some of the first organized farming systems in human history. And they faced the same problem homeowners face today. Weeds. Plants competing with crops for water, sunlight, and nutrients. Their solution was surprisingly familiar. Fermented vinegar. Applied along field edges and between crop rows to suppress unwanted growth. Thousands of years later, Roman farmers were doing the same thing. Military engineers used concentrated vinegar to keep roads clear of invasive vegetation. Monasteries in medieval Europe documented similar practices in their garden records. Different civilizations, different languages, different centuries, Yet they all arrived at the same conclusion. Vinegar works, not because someone sold it to them, because experience taught them, generation after generation, which is what makes the next part so interesting. If people separated by thousands of years all discovered the same solution independently, there must be a powerful reason behind it. And that reason is hidden inside every leaf. Because the moment vinegar touches a weed, a chain reaction begins that the plant cannot stop. The science behind vinegar is surprisingly simple, and that may be exactly why it has survived for thousands of years. Every leaf on every plant is protected by a thin outer coating called the cuticle. Think of it as the plant's waterproof jacket. Its job is to keep moisture inside and protect the leaf from heat, wind, and environmental stress. As long as that protective layer remains intact, the plant can survive. But the moment vinegar touches it, everything begins to change. The acetic acid starts breaking down that waxy barrier almost immediately. Tiny openings appear across the surface of the leaf. Moisture begins escaping. Cell walls start collapsing. The plant can no longer hold onto the water it needs to survive. Scientists call this process desiccation. Most homeowners would describe it more simply. The weed dries out. Fast. What makes this mechanism so powerful is that it does not depend on complex chemistry. It does not need to travel through the plant. It does not need weeks to take effect. The damage begins at the point of contact, which is why weeds often start wilting within hours of application. And once enough moisture is lost, recovery becomes impossible. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting. Because this is not just ancient farming wisdom anymore. Modern government researchers decided to test vinegar against some of the most stubborn weeds in America. And the results surprised almost everyone. Ancient farmers believed in vinegar because they could see the results. Modern researchers believed in data. So eventually, someone decided to test it. Not in a backyard. Not in a garden. In controlled research trials. And that is where things became difficult to ignore. Scientists began applying acetic acid solutions to some of the most common weeds found across North America. Dandelions, crabgrass, clover, broadleaf weeds that homeowners spend years fighting. The goal was simple. Measure how effective vinegar actually was. The results surprised many researchers. At standard household strength, 5% acetic acid, young broadleaf weeds showed extremely high mortality rates after treatment. In many cases, visible damage appeared within hours. Within a day, large numbers of weeds were already beyond recovery. As concentrations increased, the results became even more dramatic. Stronger horticultural vinegar solutions were capable of damaging even tougher and more established weeds. For researchers, the conclusion was difficult to dismiss. The mechanism was real. The effect was measurable. And the results were repeatable. But perhaps the most surprising discovery wasn't how well vinegar worked. It was what happened afterward. Because unlike many synthetic herbicides, vinegar doesn't linger in the environment for months. And that single difference creates a problem for an industry built around something very different. A problem worth billions of dollars. Now imagine you own a company that sells weed killers. Not one bottle. Millions of bottles. Year after year. Now imagine someone walks into the room and places a $2 bottle of vinegar on the table. A product that cannot be patented, cannot be trademarked, cannot be locked behind proprietary formulas, and can be purchased in almost every grocery store in America. Suddenly, the problem becomes obvious, because every successful business depends on one thing: repeat customers. A homeowner who buys a specialized weed killer every spring is a customer. A homeowner who solves the problem with a bottle already sitting under the kitchen sink is not. And that creates an uncomfortable conflict. The global herbicide market generates billions of dollars every year. Entire product lines, advertising campaigns, distribution networks, research budgets, all built around the idea that weed control requires specialized commercial products. But vinegar doesn't fit into that system. Nobody owns it, nobody controls it, nobody can charge premium prices for it, and that's what makes it dangerous. Not dangerous to lawns, dangerous to business models. Whether intentional or not, cheap solutions often receive less attention than expensive ones, not because they don't work, but because there is less financial incentive to promote them. Which brings us to the most important part of this entire story. Because knowing that vinegar works is one thing, knowing exactly how to use it is something completely different, and the ratio matters more than most people realize. So what should you actually do? The answer depends on the type of weed you're fighting. For young weeds, the solution is surprisingly simple. No complicated mixing, no secret ingredients, no expensive equipment, just ordinary white distilled vinegar. Pour it into a spray bottle and apply it directly to the leaves on a warm, dry day. Sunlight helps accelerate the process. The vinegar damages the protective surface of the plant, moisture begins escaping, and the weed starts drying out from the moment contact occurs. For many common annual weeds, that's enough. But some weeds are more stubborn. Deep-rooted perennials have spent years building underground energy reserves. Killing the visible growth is only part of the battle. For those tougher invaders, many gardeners use a stronger mixture. Vinegar, a small amount of table salt, and a few drops of dish soap. The soap helps the solution stick to the leaves. The salt increases the drying effect. Together, they create a far more aggressive treatment. But there is one important rule. Apply carefully. This mixture does not know the difference between a weed and a flower. If it touches a plant, it can damage it. And that leads us to the one limitation that critics often point to whenever vinegar enters the weed control conversation. Because no solution is perfect. Not even this one. Now, let's talk about the part most videos conveniently skip. The limitation. Because vinegar is powerful. But it is not magic. And understanding the difference matters. When vinegar touches a weed, it attacks the visible plant tissue above ground. The leaves, the stems, the exposed growth. That is why results can appear so quickly, sometimes within hours. But not every weed stores its strength above the surface. Some of the toughest weeds in America have spent years building extensive root systems underground. Those roots act like energy reserves. Even after the visible growth is destroyed, the root may still contain enough stored energy to send up new shoots later. This is why some deeply established perennial weeds require more than one treatment. Not because the vinegar failed. Because the plant is fighting back using resources you cannot see. And honestly, that criticism is fair. Vinegar is primarily a contact herbicide. It is not designed to move through an entire plant the way some synthetic products do. But here's the question most homeowners never ask. If a $2 solution requires 2 or 3 applications, is that really a problem? Especially when many expensive weed killers require repeated applications too. The difference is that one approach costs a few dollars. The other can cost hundreds over time. And that brings us to the final piece of this story. Because the most surprising part isn't the science. It's how many people already knew this long before we did. In the end, this story was never really about vinegar. It was about memory. For thousands of years, farmers solved weed problems without specialized herbicides. The Sumerians knew it. Roman farmers knew it. Generations of families knew it. They did not need billion-dollar advertising campaigns to convince them. They trusted what worked. A simple bottle. A simple method. Passed from one generation to the next. Then something changed. Over time, old knowledge was replaced by new products. Simple solutions became forgotten. And many homeowners began believing that every problem required an expensive answer. But the bottle never disappeared. It stayed exactly where it had always been. On grocery store shelves, under kitchen sinks, waiting. The science supporting it still exists. The historical records still exist. And the experiences of countless gardeners still exist. None of those things vanished. What disappeared was the conversation. Today, you heard that conversation again. Does vinegar solve every weed problem perfectly? No. No solution does. But understanding what it can do changes the way you look at weed control forever. Because sometimes the most powerful discoveries are not discoveries at all. Sometimes they are reminders. Reminders that long before billion-dollar industries existed, ordinary people were already solving these problems with tools simple enough to fit under a kitchen sink. And perhaps the most surprising part of this entire story is that the solution was sitting there the whole time, hidden in plain sight.